Hey everybody, it's time for our last video, and for this video I wanted to wrap it up with a little bit more discussion about parallelism, using Psalm 114 as an example. This is a great psalm. It has parallelism that really illustrates the terseness, the short lines, and yet this effect of piling on term after term, kind of in similar grammatical order. So I've made for you a schematic that's in the Hebrew, and you can easily then compare that with an English translation. What I did was to take and make all the verbs turquoise and all the subjects of the sentence, not just nouns, but the subjects of the sentence, in other words, things that can be considered significant characters and objects, are now in a pink highlighting. So the two of those things, you can look through this kind of list of verses and see the interplay between the subject and the verb in the sentences. And it's very nice, very terse, very orderly, and it fits so much into such a small amount of text that it's really quite incredible. So if we look at these, we could use the term synonymous and a loose kind of terminology to look at all of these parallel lines. But what's more interesting about them is how they pile up and add meaning to one another. So I don't think we even need to make a necessarily a sort of academic description of them, more than we need to enjoy this poetic effect of watching this whole thing unfold. If you look at verses 1 and 2, you'll see that there are two verbs, one at the front of one and one at the front of two. Underneath that, I've drawn some brackets and a little line down saying ellipsis. And this is very typical of Hebrew poetry in that we're going to have one word serving double duty and being skipped on the second line. This keeps the line from becoming too heavy and too overburdened in the Hebrew, and yet gives you kind of a double dose of the same verb, which gives added emphasis to it. The first one is not a real strong verb. It's a what am I trying to say? Anyway, it's a form that's not a totally strong verb, but it gives the time frame for when Israel went from Egypt. So there we have Israel mentioned, and then also a location, a very key location in Israel's history, and that was when Israel came out of Egypt. So Egypt is the first actual location mentioned in the psalm, and it sets us up for understanding this as being a psalm that's going to deal with the Exodus theme itself. And then we get the doubling down. Also, the house of Jacob went from a people of strange tongues. So you can see those two parallel terms there line up with one another and give an extra little boost to this idea of the time frame. And it builds out, it gives you more specificity of it. The second line there also gives you Judah and Israel again, and you can see a second ellipsis with the verb haya, which means to be. So Judah was or became God's holy place, and Israel became his people of his dominion, is kind of a loose translation. And again, you can look at your English and see how those two terms pile up on one another. So verse 1 and verse 2 line up in many ways to becoming a lovely set of sort of parallel lines with one another. And then on verses 3 and 4, we'll notice now that the verb is second in line and the subject of the sentence is first. Now, this is not usual for Hebrew, so we have poetic license happening here, where the actual subjects are pulled forward in order to give some emphasis to the subjects themselves. And they form a little list here. We have the Jordan, we have the mountains, we have first the sea, then the Jordan, then the mountains, and then the hills. And so we're kind of getting this geographical picture building up. The sea, of course, talking about coming out of Egypt, going through the Red Sea, but then the Jordan brings in this idea perhaps of crossing into the Jordan, into Canaan. So we've got a whole lot of Israel's history compiled into 4 short lines. And when these things happened, the earth itself gave way, especially when we think about the Exodus, the idea of the mountains and the hills moving and dancing. Well, this huge piling up of water could also be being thought of as earth, and all of this being under God's control. In other words, God's power is displayed in both the Exodus and the coming into Canaan, going through the other water boundary that Israel did to become a nation. Now, at verse 5, we see Malacha. What is it to you? Why did you? So it's a rhetorical question. And you'll see that I've also made that into sort of a line of its own with ellipses following all the way through, because this question actually affects the next 3 lines as well. Why is it that this happened? And we go and reiterate all the same list again: the sea, the Jordans, the mountains, and the hills. Okay, and also in kind of reversed word order, highlighting the idea that these were important areas in geographical sense for what happened to the Israelites. The rhetorical question with the subject first emphasis and the repetition of verses 3 and 4, the list there, highlights both the Exodus and the entrance into Canaan, yet once again. So we have it listed once and then why and listed again. So the repetition kind of puts that whole message before us a second time, emphasizing and strengthening it. Now at verses 7 and 8, we have a very important location mentioned first in both lines: in the presence of the Lord, in the presence of the God of Jacob. Both of those phrases come first. And in God's presence, what happens? Well, the earth shakes or dances or writhes. That word in the blue there could be translated it writhes. So we see here an emphasis being placed on the Lord, on the God of Jacob, repeated again, brought to the front of the line. And when God's present, the entire earth is subject to his presence there. And again, an unusual word order, and it really puts that emphasis on the presence of God. Now, line 8 is interesting, and you'll see that your first word is highlighted both in pink and in blue, turquoise, because it's a preposition, a participle in Hebrew. And these words in Hebrew stand somewhere between a noun and a verb. It's a verbal root, but it's being used as a noun here. So that's kind of a hybrid sort of use of the word. And it comes down to the idea of the one who turns. Okay, so this type of participle is also sometimes known as a hymnic participle, because they show up in hymns quite a bit to describe God and to describe God's characteristics here. And so in this case, it's talking about the one who brings forth water, or turns a stone into water, turns the flint into a big stream of water. In other words, God is a God of power. And these are incidents that did happen during the wandering of the wilderness, where Moses had struck the rock and water came pouring forth straight out of a rock. So in these 2 verses, we have an emphasis again on the wandering, and the emphasis here is on God's power. So in 7 and 8, we have an emphasis on both God's presence and his power, kind of wrapping up this entire short history of Israel presented in 8 verses in the Psalms. So if you ever need an efficient history lesson, there it is right there for you, with a lot of very nice repetition, but the repetition is broken up, as we can see, by ellipses and other kinds of ways of breaking it up just a little bit. So we have, for example, just to back up to verse 3 and 4, we have the list of places, but the verbs only go through the first 3 lines. The 4th line reuses a verb. So we have a little bit of a change there, and it makes it very interesting. And also in 4, we have 2 instances of comparison there. So the mountains are leaping like rams, the hills like little baby lambs. We have a simile. So there, in this particular one, we do have a figure of speech being used. That and the rhetorical question are 2 kind of key figures of speech in this psalm. So in Psalm 114, we have a good indication of a time frame, which some of them don't. We have a good indication of the location, which contributes to the time frame from Egypt. We have a lovely cast of characters and a nice list of different objects, geographical objects to work with. So it's also very specific. So I just couldn't leave the class without kind of taking you through some of this, because it is a really good example of tighter parallelism than some of the things we've seen, where we've talked about parallelism, but it doesn't really quite pan out this way. This one is extremely tidy. It's extremely very terse and very, very evocative. So I hope you enjoy this one. And I hope that you've had as good a time as I have with this class. You guys have been great. I've really enjoyed spending time with you. So blessings to y'all. We'll talk to you again soon. Bye now.